Let us have a look at the relationship between the types of rivers and the water table. Remember that when it rains, some of the water will stay on the earth's surface as runoff, and the rest of the water will infiltrate or soak into the earth and accumulate inside the earth's surface as groundwater. That infiltrated water or groundwater will accumulate and build up inside the earth's surface. The upper boundary or the upper level of all that accumulated groundwater is called the water table. The water table fluctuates in its height at various times of the year and is dependent on the amount of the rainfall and more especially on the amount of water that actually infiltrates the earth's surface. In the diagram, the orange line represents the earth's surface and the blue arrow represents the infiltrated water. The diagram shows the different levels and heights of the water table at different times of the year. The green represents the height of the water table during the wettest part of the year, in other words, during the wet season, whereas the purple represents the height of the water table during the driest time of the year. The purple line, which is known as the dry season water table, in theory represents the lowest point to which the groundwater is ever going to decrease, meaning that the area below the dry season water table is permanently saturated with water. This is called the zone of permanent saturation. It simply means that the area or the part of the earth below the dry season water table always has water in it, regardless of what time of the year this would be. The area between the purple and the green only has water inside the ground at certain time of the year, and the water in the zone of intermittent saturation only builds up during the wet season where there's more infiltration, and then the height of the water table then rises. So very important to remember that is the Earth's surface. The area just below the Earth's surface is said to be unsaturated because the water doesn't gather here, it simply passes through. Then at the driest time of the year, we have what is called the dry season water table, and very importantly, the part of the earth below the dry season water table always has water in it. Hence it is called the zone of permanent saturated, meaning that there is always water inside the earth in this section. However, during the wet season where there's added rain and added infiltration, the height of the water table is going to rise, and let's assume up to the point as seen in the diagram. That means that in the zone of intermittent saturation, there is only water in this part of the ground during the wet season. When there is a river channel, as seen in the diagram, that intersects or cuts through both the wet season water table and the dry season water table, such a river always has water in its river channel. The height and the volume of the water in such a river might decrease and fluctuate and increase at other times. However, what's important to remember is that regardless of whether we have a dry season water table or the wet season water table with a higher volume, the river always has water in it. Such a river is said to be a perennial river. We can also speak about such a river being called a permanent river. A perennial river is a river that flows throughout the year. In essence, it means that such a river always has water in it. And how is it possible for a perennial or a permanent river to always have water in it? It stems from the fact that the river channel intercepts both the wet season water table and the dry season water table, bearing in mind that the area below the dry season water table is permanently saturated and permanently has water in it. A non-perennial river, also called a periodic river, is a river that only flows during the wet season or during the rainy season. Such a river channel only has water in it during the wet season. The reason for that is because the river channel only intercepts the wet season water table. The dry season water table, the area where there is permanently water in that part of the earth, is below the base of the river channel, and hence this river only has water in it during the wet season. So a non-perennial or a periodic river is a river that only has water in it during the wet season, and the reason for that is because the river channel only intercepts the wet season. During the dry season, when the water table drops to well below the base of the river, this river has no water in it. Please do pay attention to the mapwork application as well. A very, very common question would be to answer how non-perennial rivers or periodic rivers are an indication of the type of rainfall. Hence, you would say that non-perennial rivers indicate seasonal rainfall. In other words, these rivers only flow during the wet season, and hence that is an indication that the rain only flows in certain times of the year. Just be very careful that the wet season doesn't necessarily mean winter. It would be winter in the Western Cape, for example, but in other parts of South Africa, that wet season could be in summer. An episodic river is a river that only flows after heavy rainfall. Such a river is not fed by groundwater. In other words, such a river is not fed by water during the wet season, and neither is it fed by water during the dry season. The reason for that is because the river channel in which the water is going to flow is above the wet season water table, and it is above the dry season water table. An episodic river gets its water from rainfall, and this river channel only has water in it after heavy rainfall. It is not dependent on any specific season. Whenever there's sufficient rain and there's enough rainfall, then this river will have water in it. I find it easy to remember just by telling myself that this river flows after episodes of heavy rainfall. Finally, we have what is called an exotic river. An exotic river is characterized by the fact that it starts in an area that receives a high amount of rainfall, but then it flows through an area that is very dry. So exotic rivers start in wet areas, but they then do flow through areas that are very dry. The Nile River would be a good example, as well as in South Africa, the Orange Garib River, which starts high up in the Drakensberg Mountains, where there's a high amount of rainfall. However, that river flows towards the Atlantic Ocean through the Northern Cape, which is in essence dry. In general, you're going to find that the upper course of this exotic river is fed by groundwater, water that has infiltrated the earth. However, the lower course is not fed by infiltrated water. The lower course of the exotic river simply has water in it because that water is being carried from the upper course. If you have a look at the two diagrams, the first diagram represents the river in the upper course, where the river channel intercepts both the wet season and the dry season water table. However, this exotic river in its lower course is well above the wet season and the dry season water table. However, this river will have water in it because the source of the water is found in the upper course.